Good afternoon again, and I should say, I suppose it could be good morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. Again, my name is Jessica Haire. I am a partner in Thompson Hine's Government Contracts Practice Group, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. This is the 8th in a series of webinars examining what this shift in presidential power could mean for the country. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. 1, today's program is being recorded, and we will send a link to all attendees within 48 hours of today's presentation. 2, if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to use the question box located in the control panel on the right side of your screen to submit questions. We will answer as many of the questions as we can at the end of the webinar, and those we're unable to get to, we will certainly follow up after the webinar. 3, we will be offering CLE credit for today's webinar. Please be sure to fill out and return the webinar affirmation form that can be found in the handout section of the control panel located on the right-hand side of your screen. The form provides instructions as to where to send the completed form. You will need a tracking code, which I will announce at the end of the program. 4, in the handout panel, you can also download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and bios of today's speakers. Again, thank you for your interest, and if you have questions as we go along, again, please use the question box. At this time, I am delighted to introduce my colleagues that will also be presenting today. Joining me today are Tom Mason, Chip Purcell, and Joe Berger. And Joe is going to start us off today, and I will turn it over to him at this point.
Thank you, Jessica. And before we turn to the executive orders, let's revisit the presidential campaign and candidate Biden's proposals. It was in a July speech in Pennsylvania that Biden introduced his Build Back Better plan. And he called for $400 billion in new government procurement to modernize infrastructure, replenish critical stockpiles, and enhance national security. And Biden called for $300 billion in new research and development to sharpen America's competitive edge. And Biden said then, and he said again several times, he said, American manufacturing was the arsenal of democracy in World War II. And it has to be part of the new engine of prosperity in America now. Biden proposed a series of major new investment initiatives to promote U.S. national interests, and he proposed that this would be the largest mobilization of public investments in procurement, infrastructure, and R&D since World War II. And he put forward the $400 billion proposal to make a historic procurement investment, and this plan is intended to support U.S. manufacturing and the domestic industrial base. These plans were closely related to Biden's proposals on Buy American. The Biden plan also proposed research and development. Biden proposed $300 billion in new R&D to increase U.S. research and development on a scale, according to the plan, well beyond the Apollo program. And this would be federally funded R&D across all 50 states. The campaign released a separate $2 trillion plan for an equitable clean energy future. This plan is focused on combating climate change with a plan to reach net zero emissions by 2050, but it also included significant procurement proposals, and we'll see what those are in just a few minutes. The plan proposed a historic investment in clean energy innovation, relying again on federal procurement and R&D. The Biden campaign also released a plan for infrastructure, a separate overlapping $1.3 trillion plan, and we'll talk more about infrastructure in just a few minutes. By the way, it's worth noting that during the campaign, during the transition, during the beginning of the new administration, Biden and his White House team have said that they have 4 major priorities, those being fighting the pandemic, reviving the economy and economic recovery, advancing racial equity, and combating climate change. And it's interesting to see that during the campaign and during the beginning of the new administration, contracting and grants play an important role in the administration's plans relating to each of these major priorities. So let's take a look at the executive orders issued so far as they relate to government contracting. President Biden's executive orders set policy and expectations for the role of government contracting and grants in several areas, including, as you know, obviously the pandemic response, advancing racial equity, Buy American, clean energy, and U.S. supply chains. One of the many important policy mandates that was issued in the first 10 days was the procurement policy set out in the January 25 executive order on Buy American. My colleague Chip Purcell is going to discuss this in a little more detail, but I just wanted to mention here that this was one of the executive orders issued in the first 10 days, and it was important because it sets the context for many other initiatives and actions that will occur over the next several years, and we'll discuss this in more detail in just a few minutes. The Day 1 executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government, another important executive order, and this was a broad executive order. It covered many issues and topics. Among the many issues covered was the role of procurement. And this requires, within 200 days, a review by each agency of potential barriers that underserved communities and individuals may face in agency procurement and contracting opportunities. Given the importance of the Day 1 actions, this review can be expected to lead to increasing attention within federal agencies on improving opportunities for various categories of disadvantaged small businesses, for hub zones, and for minority and women-owned small business contracting programs. And Biden has previously proposed to increase opportunities for small disadvantaged businesses under the SBA's Section AA program, and to require prime contractors to increase opportunities for these businesses. So we expect future measures along these lines. The Day 1 executive order on the pandemic response, another broad executive order, again covered many issues, but we highlight just one, the role of the Defense Production Act, which we highlight here because it's a unique procurement tool. And the Day 1 executive order called for the use of the DPA. Biden's detailed plan to fight the pandemic also called for use of the DPA. The Day 2 executive order on a sustainable public health supply chain also called for use of the DPA. And as you know, the DPA is just one tool. Procurement plays a broader role, and there's new funding pending right now in the rescue plan, which is now back before the House, with funding for vaccines, vaccination programs, testing, and the DPA and other response efforts. The Biden administration has begun to invoke the DPA, in connection with vaccines, surgical gloves, and COVID test kits. It has the goal of distributing 60 million at-home test kits by summer 21. The Trump administration also invoked the DPA throughout its response. And the Biden campaign proposed to use the DPA more broadly in connection with other critical supply chains. So commercial companies can expect DPA-rated orders and FAR clauses as well to flow more frequently throughout the supply chain over the next several years, and not limited to the pandemic response. As you know, DPA orders will require commercial companies to respond carefully because rated orders require priority under the law. Another executive order on January 27, the EO on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. Again, a broad executive order covering many issues, but this executive order includes a section on the use of the federal government's buying power. And this section requires all available authorities to achieve two primary goals: a carbon pollution-free electricity sector no later than 2035, and a zero-emission vehicle fleet for federal, state, local, and tribal governments. The order requires these purchases to be made in America following the Buy American executive order. And so the business community and the contracting community can expect increased demand, not only for electric vehicles, but for clean power, including solar and wind. And the Biden administration followed soon after that with an announcement on February 11 of a new $100 million fund to support low carbon energy technologies. And we can expect more research and development and more grants and procurement focusing on clean energy goals. By the way, it's interesting, and it's no coincidence that the day after Biden signed the clean energy executive order, the day after was the decision, the announcement by General Motors that it would transition to an all-electric fleet and end production of gas-powered cars by 2035. And that is an example of the power of U.S. procurement policy. The U.S. government is the world's biggest customer and has the power to influence the U.S. economy and to help achieve technology breakthroughs. And you can see that Biden's policies, they aim to achieve the same advances in the U.S. economy and technology breakthroughs with policies on Buy American, supply chains, R&D, and support for emerging technologies. Another executive order on U.S. supply chains, and this is based on the policy, which is a bipartisan policy, supported by Congress also, that the U.S. needs resilient supply chains, and not just to fight the pandemic, but for many national security reasons in many different sectors, for example, including cybersecurity. This EO calls for a 100-day review focusing on 4 product areas, those being pharmaceutical APIs, critical minerals, semiconductors, and large capacity batteries. The EO also requires a 1-year review in a broader set of supply chain sectors, those being the defense industrial base, public health, information and communications, the energy sector, the transportation sector, and the agriculture and food production sector. And this is a big chunk of the U.S. economy, and that simply reflects a focus, again, bipartisan by both not only the Biden administration, but the Trump administration as well, and Congress, on the resilience of U.S. supply chains in many different areas. Just to put in context a few of Biden's remarks before signing the supply chain executive order. When Biden said this is about more than just fighting the pandemic, but also defense, cybersecurity, climate change, and the best way to do that is by sharpening America's competitive edge. And he made similar remarks at the Pentagon, which he visited on February 10, where he said, "We need to take on the dangers and opportunities of emerging technologies enhance our capabilities in cyberspace, ensure that we are positioned to lead in a new era of competition from deep sea to outer space. And we'll talk very briefly at a high level on defense and space policies. Very briefly, Biden's remarks and his early actions indicate support for a relatively stable defense budget driven by great power competition. That's competition with rivals, China and Russia. Continued focus on emerging technologies, continued focus on cybersecurity. And in space, the administration has announced support for the U.S. Space Force and support for NASA's Project Artemis, which require, both of them, support for commercial spaceflight. And by the way, it's been in the news, it's been discussed in the news that it's hard to keep major space programs going from one administration to the next. And many have not survived, but here we have support for these two major programs. Project Artemis is NASA's lunar exploration program with the goal to send the next man and first woman to the moon. And the goal has been within the next 4 years. The time frame may change, but the program has support and will continue. And with the longer term goal of exploration to Mars. So it's great to see support for this program. And speaking of Mars, it's also been reported in the news that Biden watched the Mars rover land, that he has a moon rock in the Oval Office. Vice President Harris has spoken with U.S. astronauts aboard the International Space Station, and she even mentioned the moon landing in an inspirational way during her remarks on Inauguration Day. And we know this administration, like the last administration, is interested in space as a policy priority, which is a great thing for the commercial space industry, and we think a great thing for the nation. And we wanted to mention also the role of other transaction authority. This applies, this is used most often in the space and defense context. As you know, it was created with NASA, and the Defense Department has received increasing authority to use OTs over the last few years. And OTs were subject of the most recent National Defense Authorization Act, and this interest in OTs results in part from their role in Operation Warp Speed, the government program, as you know, that facilitated the work by DoD, HHS, and the private sector to develop vaccines in record time. OTs are designed for maximum speed and flexibility, which were key in the successful work of this program. Let's take a quick look at the American Rescue Act, which, as you know, is back before the House of Representatives today and may be signed into law this week. As you know, this is legislation that was proposed by Biden during the transition. Proposals were announced by the White House on day one. Priorities included the National Vaccination Program, scaled up testing, emergency relief, funding for schools, public health jobs, and among many priorities, also the purchase of critical supplies through domestic manufacturing. The rescue plan was to be followed by a recovery plan, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. And as you know, the rescue plan passed in the House, it passed in the Senate. There were a few changes in the Senate, and it's back before the House. A few highlights relating to procurement and grants here, funding for various programs. Obviously, this is mammoth legislation, 1.9 trillion legislation, and these are just a few highlights that may relate to procurement and grants. Obviously, there's funding for vaccines, vaccination programs, supply chains, also significantly for testing, contact tracing, and more funds for the public health workforce and agencies. There's funding for the Defense Production Act in the amount of $10 billion specifically set aside for purchases under the DPA. As you know, there's funding for state and local fiscal recovery. And I saw just yesterday Senator Manchin on TV talking about this aspect of the rescue plan, and he was saying that that the state and local funds may facilitate infrastructure because they'll allow states and localities to pursue infrastructure projects that they might otherwise have pursued if not for the funding crisis. And also funding for other agencies. There's some level for transportation and infrastructure, including FEMA, and for Veterans Health and the Department of Agriculture. And we'll talk more about infrastructure in just a few minutes. Wanted to mention a few changes. The Senate amendments added a $10 billion program for critical infrastructure projects that focus on pandemic response, focusing on work, education, health monitoring, including remote options. And the Senate also added greater funding for IT and cybersecurity priorities, including for CISA, the GSA Technology Modernization Fund, and the U.S. Digital Service. Before we talk more about infrastructure, my colleague Chip Purcell is going to discuss the Buy American issues in greater detail. Chip, over to you.
Thanks, Joe. As Joe said, I'm going to address what we broadly define as made in America, and that encompasses a number of laws, including the Buy American Act, which is sort of a bedrock principle in federal procurement, as well as the Buy America Act, which deals specifically with federal transportation contracts. And today I'm going to discuss really two parts of these, both new rules and an executive order. The new rules deal with changes that come from the Trump administration to the Buy American Act regulations. And I'm also going to talk about an executive order that was issued by President Biden. Joe touched on it, that it sets forth policy initiatives, some short-term changes, some longer-term changes to the government's Made in America laws. So Joe, if you could advance the slide, please. So first, I'm going to talk about a final rule that was issued back in January that implemented changes to the Buy American Act regulations and the federal acquisition regulation, the government's acquisition regulations. The final rule flowed from an executive order that was issued by President Trump back in the summer of 2020, back last July, aimed at implementing a number of changes to the current then current Buy American Act regulations. Interestingly, as part of the new administration, the president directed a regulatory freeze, common among many new administrations, that required agencies to freeze regulations that had not yet been implemented. That regulatory freeze came a day after these new regulations were implemented. So these are regulations that are currently in effect. They were effective for solicitations that were issued on or after the February 22nd of this year, as well as resulting contracts. So these are currently new regulations that are going to be impacting procurements going forward. Joe, next slide, please. So there are a couple of major changes that came with this new final rule in the FAR to the Buy American Act. The first deals with changes to what we refer to the cost of component tests for domestic end products. So to back up, domestic end products are defined as first, really two prongs. First, end products that are manufactured in the United States, and second, end products for which the cost of components that are mined, manufactured, or produced in the U.S. must exceed 50% of the cost of all the components that go into that end product. However, that cost of component test is dropped if we're talking about what are defined as commercially available off-the-shelf items. And those are commercial items that are sold in substantial quantities in the commercial marketplace and offered to the government under a contract without any modification in the same form that a commercial buyer would. So if you're selling a commercially available off-the-shelf or COTS item to the government, it just has to be manufactured in the United States to meet the Buy American Act requirements. It doesn't have to meet the cost of component test that we're talking about. Under the new regulation, going forward, rather than have the cost of components for U.S. or domestic components exceed 50%, the new regulation lifts that to 55%. So you've got to have, unless it's a COTS product, you have to have an end product for which the cost of components that are manufactured, produced domestically, they have to be greater than 55% of the cost of all of those components. The new regulation also identifies what are, and this is really largely for construction products, not exclusively, but a lot of it impacts construction-based procurements, and products that are wholly or predominantly or a combination of both comprised of iron or steel. And that's for products for which 50% or more of that product is comprised of iron or steel. In that case, the end product has to be, first, manufactured in the United States, and second, less than 5% of the total component costs can be for foreign iron or steel. So in other words, at least 95% of the cost of components of these iron or steel end products have to be comprised of domestic components. And there's an exclusion though for COTS fasteners, for commercially available off-the-shelf fasteners. The government figured that it's too hard to track the costs of those, so those are not factored into that 5% or less requirement for iron or steel end products. The other change though is that there is no COTS waiver. So as with the first type of end products that we're talking about, you can waive that component test for COTS items. That doesn't apply in the case of iron or steel end products. Joe, next slide, please. The other major change that came with the new regulations is a change to the price evaluation preference that's applied to domestic end products. And again, to back up, the Buy American Act does not act as a preclusion on the government buying non-domestic end products. It simply requires that when the government is evaluating various proposals, both domestic and foreign, that they are determining the price reasonableness of the low domestic end product. So if we have, pardon me, if you had a foreign end product that was the low priced offeror, and you had above that, the more expensive products were domestic end products, there would be a requirement, there is a requirement to apply this price evaluation preference. So in the case of large businesses, we have a large business procurement that previously there was a 6% price evaluation preference applied to the foreign bid. That's been raised to 20%. So they take 20% of the price of the foreign bid, added to that the baseline price, and then determine whether the foreign price, bid is still the low price bid. In the case of small business procurements, that price evaluation preference has been raised from 12% to 30%. So again, 30% price evaluation preference would be applied to a low price foreign bid from a small business. One thing to note though is that this regulatory change does not impact the balance of payments program that's used in Department of Defense procurement. That uses a 50% price evaluation preference. Joe, next slide, please. So as Joe mentioned earlier, is the part of the flurry of executive orders that President Biden issued One was aimed at changing the government's or I should say Made in America laws, again, both Buy American and Buy America. And the executive order lays out a number of short-term actions as well as sort of longer-term goals in terms of regulatory change to the existing laws. So the first major component is an update to the government's Made in America waiver process. So if agencies want to waive whatever the applicable Made in America law would be, there's a process by which they would do that. Under the executive order, the Office of Management and Budget is going to create a Made in America office that will have oversight of this sort of government-wide waiver process. So there's a director of that Made in America office who's oversees waivers that are going to be applied for and issued on a government-wide basis. The executive order calls for the development of guidance for agencies to follow if they're contemplating a waiver of the Made in America requirements. They have to submit those waiver applications to the Made in America office for review and approval or disapproval. So some creates really sort of a central focus, really, if you will, in terms of how that waiver process is going to be administered. Joe, next slide, please. The second major part is really sort of a nod toward government transparency, and that's the creation of a website that's going to be used to track these Made in America waivers. So members of the public, members of industry will be able to go to this website to look at agency waivers for Made in America requirements, to see what's comprised in that waiver, the information that's supporting it, whether they have or haven't been granted, to be able to let members of the public see, for particular procurements or in particular industries, what agencies are doing to try to get around the existing Made in America Act requirements. Longer term, the executive order calls for modifications to the Buy American Act regulations. We just initially touched on changes that have been implemented effective January to the Buy American Act regulations. The executive order calls for the FAR Council, the folks who administer the federal acquisition regulation, within 180 days of the order to consider some further amendments to the Buy American Act regulations in the FAR, replace that component test we were talking about. So looking at what the cost of components that go into an end product, both domestic and foreign components, replacing that with something that's focused more on value-based, as the term is used in the executive order. And again, it's not defined beyond potentially looking at costs that could be based on U.S. production, U.S. supporting economic activity. So this is something I think that it's going to take some time to play out to see how it manifests itself in proposed changes to the FAR to get rid of the current component test, looking at factors that look more at, rather than cost of these components, job creation, who's involved in the manufacture, the production of components that are going to an end product. The second prong of this, the proposed regulatory changes would increase those domestic content requirements that we talked about before. So again, yet to be seen what that's going to look like, but another area for potential change. The third would be to raise the price evaluation preferences that we talked about too. So they've gone up fairly substantially in the last regulations, and they could stand to go up even further, depending on what the FAR Council does. Joe, next slide, please. Next proposed change that was set forth in the executive order is one that's fairly significant, and that requires the FAR Council to look at and review the current exemption under the Buy American Act regulations for information technology commercial items. So currently, commercial items that are IT item or information technology products that qualify as commercial items are exempt from the Buy American Act regulatory requirements. So it's a fairly broad exemption. So again, the executive order doesn't provide a lot of guidance beyond requiring the FAR Council to look at whether that's an exemption that can continue, and and potentially exempting or rescinding it, pardon me, with I guess really trying to increase the amount of domestic manufactured or produced information technology products that the government might procure. So again, we'll see how this plays out, because this is a fairly large exemption under the current BA regulations. The executive order also requires agencies to provide to the Made in America office within 180 days information on their implementation and compliance with Made in American Act requirements and their use of waivers. So again, really trying to get the government's arms around how waivers are being used by agencies. The last part of the executive order revoked a number of, and I think there were 5 or 6 Trump administration Made in America Act or Made in America, pardon me, executive orders of different flavors. The one it did not revoke was the one we talked about before, which directed the changes to the Buy American Act regulations that were effective back in January. So that's what I have on Buy American Act. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Jessica to talk about infrastructure issues. Jessica?
Thanks, Chip. Okay, let's talk infrastructure. Let's head to that first slide, please. So I probably don't have to tell you all, infrastructure touches every economic output in this country, but it's more than that, right? It impacts public safety, response time, school bus transportation. As we've seen in Texas in the last month, energy infrastructure has life or death impacts. From a political standpoint, it's something that tends to have bipartisan support. And it was a key piece of the 2016 and 2020 elections. So it's likely that it will be critical in any economic recovery in the upcoming years. And we're all sitting here kind of anxiously waiting to see what that infrastructure package coming out of this administration will look like, and really what it means for government contractors in each of the infrastructure areas. So while we don't know exactly what it's going to look like, there's a lot of speculation at this stage. Today, we're going to take a look at some of the key factors that will likely influence the package, the key questions remaining, and what it means for the government contractors. So we'll start with the American Society of Civil Engineers grading report. We'll take a look at some recent legislation, the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 and the Recovery Act of 2009. And then we'll take a look at some of the campaign items from President Biden and how we can get guidance from that. We don't have a date in place for this legislation, but the Chambers of Commerce are really pushing something in the first half of this year. I have heard a targeted date of before July 4th. So that's where we'll look to that date for starts. The key questions remaining, obviously, like I said, what's it going to look like? What will the funding mechanism be? That's a big question for everyone. And then what added enforcement and regulations will flow from it? And what does that mean specifically for projects that get funded under it? Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're going to take a look at the American Society of Civil Engineers grading report. To some extent, the content of the infrastructure bill can likely be informed by the current state of infrastructure in the country. So this is a grading report that the ASCE puts out every 4 years. They look nationally and they grade a whole host of different infrastructure areas based on capacity, condition, funding, future need, operations, and maintenance. So in 2017, they graded 16 categories. In 2021, which actually just came out last Wednesday, they added a 17th category, one for stormwater. You can see the categories there. The overall grade this year is a C-, which of course leaves lots of room for improvement. The ASCE notes that there is a $2.6 trillion gap in funding over the next decade. So that's really where I think any kind of infrastructure package coming out will focus. The reports have a grading scale from A to F. A is indicating that infrastructure is exceptional, fit for the future. B is good to excellent. C is mediocre with some elements exhibiting significant deficiencies in conditions and functionality. D has a strong risk of failure, and F is unacceptable condition with widespread advanced signs of deterioration. So as I mentioned, the overall grade was a C minus, but the ranges for each category went from a B to a D. And so I want to highlight a couple of these specific categories and circle back to them later, because I think this is where we will see the heaviest investment in infrastructure spending. So transit was the worst category grade. It had a D minus. The best was rail with a B. Roads and bridges, which typically receive high funding, had a C, which is actually a downgrade from what they received 4 years ago. So I think that's an important one to watch. The study showed that 8% of bridges are structurally deficient in the country. Courts received a B minus. And interestingly, that C minus is actually an upgrade from 4 years ago where we got a D plus. So I think that will show you there has been some investment in the last 4 years. And I think that that's partly why this has come up a little bit. That C minus is the best we've had in 20 years. So let's take a look then at some of the more recent legislation and how that has impacted infrastructure. Next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021. This was signed really in the last month of the Trump administration. I think it was December 27th, 2020. And it included some pretty significant spending on infrastructure, $45 billion in transportation funding. And what I really want you to take away from this here is notice that transit agencies piece, $14 billion. That was the largest single area of transportation, of infrastructure spending that came in here, other than sort of airlines, which of course was a massive issue. I expect this is going to be a trend, especially after we got that D minus in transit. So I think we'll see more of this funding on top of that $14 billion moving forward. Other areas to get it: highways, airports, as I mentioned, airline contractors, Amtrak, buses and US vessels, etc. Okay, next slide, please. So the second piece of legislation that I think is really critical to look at is the Recovery Act of 2009. Obviously, Biden is very familiar with this, given that he was the vice president at the time. A lot of you probably remember this. It was the Recovery Act, Stimulus Act, or ERA, depending on how you want to call it. At the time, it was $787 billion. So that should put into perspective kind of what we may be looking at with this infrastructure package. 105 billion of that 787 was in infrastructure, and 48 billion of that, and specifically, was for transportation projects. Next slide, please. At that level of spending, we've seen reports now that sort of 42,000 miles of roads, right? 850 new transit facilities, 800 airport facilities. This was a big investment, and it paid long-term dividends in that sense. And so I say that just because, again, I would expect that the Recovery Act will be a key piece of influence for President Biden. A key takeaway from the Recovery Act that I think we need to focus on are provisions related to transparency, accountability, and enforcement. Because I think we'll see some similar provisions and even strengthening of some of these provisions moving forward. Reporting requirements for recipients of recovery funds were in there, publicizing of contract actions, GAO and Inspector General access to company employees, whistleblower protections, those Buy American requirements for construction materials. I think we will continue to see more of that and a heightening of that as we move forward. Next slide, please. And so this last piece of kind of key influences are going to be campaign statements. If we're pulling from this, the Washington Post had an interesting article on February 17th of this year about it, noting as much as $3 trillion in new spending. And I should mention, when I say that $2.6 trillion gap, that's on top of the trillions that we would already be spending. So we would really be looking, if we funded the entire infrastructure package that the American Society of Civil Engineers would like funded, it would be well over $5 trillion. So that $3 trillion number from the campaign is sort of in line with what the ASC is saying. Now, these spending figures are highly preliminary. The article notes that, but in terms of kind of sort of ballpark figures, you know what we're looking at. I think it's also helpful to know, where do we think that money is going to get spent? And so we take a look specifically at President Biden's campaign pages, and there's a couple of areas I'd like to note. First one, he talks about ports and inland waterways a lot on his campaign, and I think that that's an important thing to keep in the back of our minds. He pledges major public investments in clean automobile infrastructure, including, he specifically calls out 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations. So I think that's one to be on the lookout for. He talks specifically about funding for upgrading, retrofitting, and weatherizing buildings. And he pledges to spend $400 billion on clean energy inputs and to create a new advanced research project agency looking at that clean energy target. And I think these are all, resiliency is a word that we've heard a lot during the campaign, and I expect to hear a lot during any discussion on this infrastructure package. The last piece that he mentions in his campaign that I think is really worth noting is that he specifically talks about a series of policies to build worker power to raise wages and secure stronger benefits. And he says specifically, including expansions in union representation, collective bargaining. He talks about maintaining the Davis-Bacon Act, the project labor agreements, and these Buy American provisions. And so these are things I take from his campaign that I think we really should be on the lookout for. All right, so next slide, please, and we'll put it all together. So what does this mean? What to expect? The bottom line is I expect this administration will see an infrastructure package that targets investment in transit, ports, and energy sectors. The emphasis really is going to be environment and resiliency. And then on the back end also, in terms of policy pieces that go along with it, I think we're going to see environmental regulations and wage restrictions and wage issues play a big part. As I mentioned here, I think transit, we've seen it's got a D-. It has had some past, it has had past support. I think we'll see a lot more of that. The ports are a big one. I think we'll get a lot of funding in ports because they have the ability to really take some of the burden off of roads in a big way, inland waterways, and it builds into his resiliency type of plan very well. So I think that we're going to see a big piece there. Again, we don't have a funding mechanism, but we'll certainly see funding through federal, state, and local agencies. And then this accountability and enforcement, and I think Tom Mason is going to touch on enforcement pieces a little bit more later, but I really think we're going to see significant increased investigations related to the Davis-Bacon Act, and I would expect increased regulations for the Clean Air, Clean Water Act and violations in that sense. And then I would anticipate we would see an increase in audits that will eventually follow these federal dollars. Certainly, I will be keeping an eye on this, and I could talk a long time about infrastructure, so I will leave it here for now and turn it over to Tom Mason to pick up with program changes.
Thank you, Jessica. And I'm going to spend just a moment on program changes. And Joe, you can advance it to the next slide, please. Program changes, I want to get to a point of reality here. The government contract programs are changed every year. And program changes are the consequence of whenever there's a change in presidential administrations. And this is very practical. This really requires an understanding of fiscal law in the application of fiscal law. And so as the priorities change, as the political priorities change and the needs of the country change, we need to take a look at our contracts to see if they're going to be adjusted. And it's real important to understand that the money that is applied to federal contracts is both authorized, it's been appropriated, and it's been considered to be a reasonable amount for the job at hand. And as we see these programs change, we shouldn't be surprised when we see a contract is terminated, a contract is changed. And in any of these instances, the contractor who is performing the contract that's implicated has remedies. And I just want to stress that there's remedies. The government's not trying to take something from a contractor without appropriate compensation and making sure that the contract is performed and closed out well. Every contract has a changes clause. Every contract has a termination for convenience clause. The government has these rights. And so I think the way to look at it would be, don't be too concerned about what we read about the priorities. Be concerned as to how these priorities might impact on our contract, and then think about the funding. And perhaps there would be a need for a dialogue with the contracting officer. Many programs go for many years, and that does provide stability, and that does provide some continuity for many of the critical procurements that we see operating every day. Next slide, Joe. And I want to just give one example, just to highlight it. We've all heard in the news about the border walls. The last administration wanted to build border walls, and they used funding from various sources to do so. Some of the funding was directly authorized and appropriated by Congress to construct these walls, and other money was used out of general funds, like the Defense Fund, where money was taken from the Defense Fund. Well, here's the rule. If there's been a specific authorized and appropriation to build a border wall, that's not going to be reprogrammed. If, however, there has been a general, an application of funds that have been generally given to an agency, like the Department of Interior, the Department of Defense, and that agency has some discretion, well, what President Biden said is we're going to look at those situations where discretion was applied, and maybe we'll change our mind and reapply those funds. But first, we're going to study it. And so I think it's from a government contractor's professional point of view, we need to be looking at our specific programs to find out what the impacts, the dollar impacts are going to be, and then deal with the protections that are afforded to us in the contract, either to preserve these contracts or to be compensated if they're canceled. Let's move to the next slide. And I'm going to talk a little bit about intellectual property. Just like the law of appropriations doesn't change in terms of reprogramming, something to be expected, intellectual property law doesn't change at all. Now, we've heard all the speakers beforehand talk about greater support of the federal government budget will be given to R&D funding, research and development funding. It's going to be across the gamut, from everything from medical devices to new pharmaceuticals and to infrastructure. We're going to be focused on domestic preference, as Chip mentioned earlier. But I want to make one point to kind of put this all together, and that is the United States does not manufacture drugs or pharmaceutical products. The U.S. doesn't manufacture these. And so the key is to understand that these pharmaceutical drugs will be developed, and the research will be done and the development will be done in the private sector with some help from the government by way of some government laboratory work, some government investigation, and government funding. And so we see with the new administration that they propose to increase investment in research development, particularly in breakthrough technologies. And also we see that R&D is central to the administration's desire that the United States take on a leadership role. And the leadership role can be done if we're first and very, very innovative in terms of our health and medicine, our biotechnology, energy, clean energy, leading to the manufacturing of automobiles and aerospace. The control of the emissions of military aircraft is a very high priority still. AI, telecommunications, and just technology in general. We're going to see the increase of funding in R&D go forward. And the question for us as government contractors is how do we make the best use of this increased funding? Next slide, Joe. And so I want to introduce the Bayh-Dole Act. The Bayh-Dole Act is codified in the statute, and it's implemented through CFR regulations. And R&D funding is going to be subjected to the Bayh-Dole implementation regulations. And Bayh-Dole is really a wonderful piece of legislation that really helps small businesses and nonprofit businesses, and particularly small businesses and universities. Because as we talk about improving our technology and expending more effort and giving this more energy, we're going to be seeing the impact of R&D performed by both large companies, other countries, states, and also small companies and universities. And so the Bayh-Dole Act does one thing. It allows the contractor to own the intellectual property that's developed during the performance of a contract. It applies to all federal grants. It applies to CRADAs, cooperative agreements. It applies to nonprofits. It applies to SBIR, STTR research grants. It's going to apply to the things that we need to develop in order to fight the coronavirus family of viruses. Certainly going to be and has been important with COVID-19 in our response to that. And so I want to make mention of the Bayh-Dole Act because today the Bayh-Dole Act is undergoing change. And if you go to the next slide, Joe, we'll talk about this. So the change is that under the Bayh-Dole Act, the contractor can invent something and go to the patent office and get it invented and getting ownership of it. There's some requirements to make sure there's assignments from employees and all that. But the idea with the Bayh-Dole Act is that it's going to be IP that's going to be owned by the company, and the company is going to be able to apply that IP for legitimate government purposes. And it's going to be very, very useful in the other transactional authority arena, in the CRADA arena that have been mentioned earlier. And it's going to cover subject inventions which are defined under the FAR is those inventions conceived or reduced to practice during the grant performance. And so the change is the government used to have march-in rights where they could come in and take control if the patent purpose wasn't being followed. Now those march-in rights are being eliminated so that the government will not march in, and the IP can be practiced by the contractor. So this is a very significant area of law that we think is going to be very instrumental in moving forward. And I think it's tantamount in importance to the cybersecurity mentions. And I think Joe's got some comments with respect to cybersecurity.
Thanks, Tom. And we just wanted to mention cybersecurity because clearly it's a priority, was for the last administration and for the new administration. It's been a stated priority. We expect an executive order. And this priority will be bolstered by the most recent NDAA, which had extensive provisions on cybersecurity. We list a few here. And just briefly, we wanted to mention, of course, the SolarWinds breach, which happened after the election, before the inauguration. It was December when the news was reported that the SolarWinds software had been breached. And this was revealed to be a massive attack against government and industry. The Biden administration has placed a Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology, which is a new role in the National Security Council, in charge of responding. And what does this mean for contractors? As always, it means more attention is needed for cybersecurity, including DoD CMMC program and related DoD clauses and civilian agency cybersecurity requirements. And we can't go through them all. There's many, and there was a new rule for DoD in November. But we just wanted to highlight cybersecurity because obviously this for contractors and grantees is a big priority going forward. And also it is a potential subject of enforcement, which brings us to our last topic, enforcement. I'll turn it back over to Tom.
This is a very important piece of our presentation. That's why it's last. When we think of enforcement, we're thinking about the government's remedies to enforce contracts, to their availability of civil remedies under the Civil False Claims Act and criminal investigation remedies, also administrative remedies to suspend contractors or to bar contractors. And Joe, if you would go to the very last slide, we've got some enforcement things listed out for your reading. But I wanted to have you look at the title of this last slide. Enforcement follows funding. That's the key. Infrastructure, medical technology, when these are funded heavily by the United States, there's going to be somebody to come and look to make sure that the money is applied in the way that it was intended. And the point is that the government's going to want to make sure that it gets what it pays for, and that the performance matches what its needs were, what it advertised its needs for. Our goal as contractors is to be responsible, both technically and be financially and technically responsible. That's a requirement. We're not responsible if we're using money not to perform the contract, or if we're using money to make improper expenditures when they're found out they're going to be enforced. And so what we want to do is just to end the topic here today by just making sure that everybody understands that when this greater amount of money is applied to these areas, the government will be doing some investigation, both internally to the government and to the contractors, to make sure that the money is spent as intended and is spent wisely. And so at this, I'll turn it back over to Jessica, I believe.
Thank you, Tom. We are right at the 3 o'clock hour. So for those of you who submitted questions, we will definitely monitor those questions, read them, and direct them to the appropriate person for response. If you have additional questions after today's webinar, please feel free to email or if call your current Thompson Hine lawyer. If you're not a current Thompson Hine client, please contact one of us. We can certainly discuss with you any options to address your needs. If you're seeking CLE for today's program, the tracking code is March 9 CLE, and that is March, capital M, lowercase ARCH, the number 9, and then capital C, capital L, capital E. One more time, that code is March 9 CLE. If you're not currently receiving our updates and invitations, we invite you to go to the Thompson Hine website and register to receive our mailings under the Publications tab. Thank you all for your interest and attending today's webinar. We enjoyed spending the afternoon with you. Enjoy the rest of your day and stay well.